Okay, welcome. This is the first of a series of videos for the Higher Education Research and Evaluation doctoral program at Lancaster University. And today we're going to be talking about theory in doctoral research into higher education. But it's not going to be a heavy-duty discussion. It's partly to introduce ourselves as lecturers and deliverers on the program. If you're a member of the HERE doctoral program, you'd be very welcome to email us and we can continue the discussion afterwards. So I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Paul Trowler. I'm the director of the program and I teach on the Policy and Change module, EDS 845.
Hello, my name is Natasha Lackovic and I convene the module Learning, Teaching and Assessment in Higher Education.
And I'm Brett Bly and I convene the module Researching Higher Education, EDS S843.
Great. Okay, well, we've got a slightly structured conversation, but it is a fairly free-flowing discussion. So the first thing I'd like to open with is about the nature of theory, how we see the nature of theory. For me, theory is a series of concepts that are linked together into a whole of some sort, and they help us to explain, illuminate, and so on. Merton talks about grand theory, middle range theory, and micro theory. So we've got grand theories like postmodernism and so on, middle range theories like perhaps communities of practice theory, and micro theory tending to be down at the local level with quite restricted hypothesis testing and so on. That's how I'd see what theory is. But there are, of course, discussions about the nature of theory and even conflicts. So that more recently theory has moved away, the notion of theory has moved away from a kind of positivist, hypothesis testing, predictive set of propositions to something that involves the Imaginarium, helping us to think creatively about the world, the social world and so on, to imagine alternative futures and so on. So I'd see theory as divided into two main perspectives on really what it is. I don't know what you think about that.
I mean, I guess from my perspective, it's important to say that how theory is viewed, particularly within the higher education research community, has probably changed over time. So some people, I think, still find theory a fairly intimidating phrase, and the reason for that is partly historical, because it used to be the case that you would say a theory is only a theory if you can make predictions from it, if you can establish causality from it. And over time, that kind of definition of theory has gradually expanded. It now includes those kind of high theories that have the word theory in the name. It also includes the things that might have at one point be thought of as hypotheses, and probably a natural scientist would still perceive them as hypotheses. And it also is expanded to include those things that we're hardly aware of. They're just assumptions that we make about life every day. And I suppose that's the point, is to say that theory is a kind of codified, slightly more systematized way of accumulating experience about the world that should be permanently open to challenge and permanently open to being iterated and moved further on as we gain yet more experience. So I suppose I see theory as a much broader thing, and that's actually reflective of wider changes in the field.
Yes, I agree, and I would like to add just something about the flexibility of applying a theoretical perspective or a theory, because I think there are so many theories, but we need also to think about theories as flexible and in need of development and in need of, let's say, improvement or change, because some theories, some theoretical perspectives, they were conceived a long time ago, which means that perhaps certain things are not that relevant to some issues that we may think are more postmodern or contemporary issues, and then it is very interesting to actually think about how we can combine perspectives and also combine theoretical concepts or notions. I find that really interesting. This view that actually we don't have to stick to certain theoretical concepts or perspectives, but we we need to approach them critically, so that we think, okay, so how does this resonate with whatever I want to research, or how does this resonate with the society we live in today? So I think that's interesting to say. I would think about the nature of theory and how we apply it.
I mean, if I could build on that, I think that's a good point. I think what you're doing is opening up some sort of space between a theory developed in the past by somebody else and the theories that you have in your head that have been developed as a result of your own experience. Coming into academia might make you think more deeply about those things, but everybody has them. Everybody has them. And I suppose I would say that there's the possibility for challenge to go in both directions. So there is definitely the possibility that you're talking about, Natasha, which is to say that a theory might be old, or it might have only been relevant in a certain context and you're applying it in a new context where you discover that it doesn't quite fit. But there's also the possibility of saying this theory challenges how I'm viewing what I'm already think I know, what I already do every day. This theory says that I need to think about that differently. Now, in the end, as a researcher, you are going to be the person who decides some of those challenges. You are going to be the person who eventually writes an argument that at least tries to resolve some of those dilemmas. But there is definitely a possibility, if theory is to have any worth, that the insights gleaned gradually by other people in the past or somewhere else can teach you something. So I suppose what we're trying to do is to open up a two-way conversation all the time. And getting that dynamic right in a research project is actually incredibly difficult, I think.
Yes, exactly. And what I was trying to refer to is actually this intention to develop a theory, because I think a lot of people would be familiar that sometimes research, it is questionable actually to what extent the research we do develops a theoretical approach or a theory, and I think we can aim towards it, but it does really take a lot of work, years of work on a particular theory, or combining and compiling a lot of research studies to develop a theory.
Yes. For me anyway, a doctoral thesis the relationship in a doctoral thesis between data and theory might have one or two or three characteristics. It might be testing the data, might be testing a theory, it might be replicating a theory. It might be trying to refine a theory, or the theory might be used to look at the data through a particular lens. So there's multiple ways in which theory and data can be interrelated. Although one might say even the distinction between data and theory is binary and false. But so that's perhaps a simplistic way to look at it. You're smiling. You obviously think so.
No, I'm familiar with those kind of debates, that's all. I mean, I suppose the point is that as a researcher, you have to start with the concepts that you're familiar with. That goes for things like theory, but also your concepts of how you can conduct an investigation. So sometimes, I suppose, you realise that nearly every concept that you've been working with for some years is actually open to problematization. And it can become very destabilising. It can kind of stop you moving forward or make you think you know absolutely nothing. And I suppose research is like that. It makes you think the more and more I know about something, the less and less actually I realise I know as a proportion of some bigger whole. You kind of become more and more humble. I suppose I worry about that because in the end, the point of research is to make an argument aimed at some particular body of knowledge. So it's good to be humble at certain points in a research process, and theory can do that. But it shouldn't be a debilitating condition that says that by the end of a research project, you couldn't go and advocate some findings in relation to a body of knowledge or at a conference to a particular group of people or something like that. So I think being humble and then gaining confidence is actually a crucial part of the research journey, and theory really can inform that, so long as you don't let it go too far, I
Exactly.
suppose.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's important to remember that a doctorate isn't a Nobel Prize.
Exactly.
It's a little contribution to knowledge that you're making usually.
Exactly.
So, you know, it's yeah. And you can come out with some really good, you know, I know nothing, you might conclude, but I've got some really good questions. I think maybe we ought to move on to the next section, which is about tacit theories. But we've touched on that already. Is there anything else you wanted to say on that, Brett?
Yeah, I suppose the question that plenty of students on the programme ask, I think this comes up repeatedly, is that the way it's posed is sometimes how theoretical do I need to be? There's a question that seems to be hanging in the air at that moment, which is theory really worth it, or something like that. And I suppose my answer to that is, if you take this enlarged view of theory that we were talking about before, you effectively arrive at a position in the end where you say you're always being theoretical. You've always made assumptions, you've always gained experiences in your past life, you've also been informed by the things you've read before, not just on prior courses, because by the time you do a doctorate you've already had a lot of prior learning, but in your life as a whole. You've imbibed a load of things from your culture, from the activities you've participated in. So you're always being theoretical. The difference is, how open are you being about that? How directly are you acknowledging that? And I suppose the point for me about research is that if you can make that explicit, if you can directly acknowledge that you can take you can have some new advantages, but you can also acknowledge some of the problems more directly. What you're doing is taking something that used to be personal or hidden and rendering it into the world, so that you can say, these are the assumptions I made, this is what I thought when I started this project, that's why I designed the project in this way, and therefore somebody else could come along and say, well, actually I disagree with that for these reasons. Whereas if you're being theoretical in a way that never admits that can't happen. So you're limiting the possibility for debate within the community. So my view is, it's not necessary to just use lots of long words, absolutely not. But it is necessary to acknowledge your starting points, and many of those starting points will intrinsically be theoretical, even if the theory is only some set of concepts. Not all theories have to have the word theory in the title, as we were saying earlier. Some of them seem quite modest.
Can I just build on that? Just to put it simply, I think what you were talking about, just to summarize, is first of all to ask yourself, okay, so what are my beliefs? Because presumably we all have particular beliefs, and then those beliefs about the nature of knowledge and how knowledge is produced, or the reality in the world, or whether there is the reality, how we know it, and etc., that will inform the way how you actually approach your search for, I would say, appropriate theory for your own beliefs. But I think it's very important to actually be very clear about those beliefs, and be very clear about what the theory that you would, let's say the lenses that you would adopt, what kind of questions you can actually answer with that theoretical lenses. Because one theory that's the approach or the view that I have can only answer particular questions, and can also give only partial views on holistic situations. So it's very difficult to claim more holistic, let's say, findings. So it's very, very important in writing a doctoral thesis, in the end, to be very clear about your contribution to knowledge, and what exactly, your research questions and your findings and the theoretical lenses you're applying, what exactly your contribution to knowledge is, because it can never be complete.
Yeah.
That's my view.
Yeah, no, transparency, I think we're agreeing, is really important. Although I suppose, I mean, those culturally derived theories and ways of seeing and so on, Gould calls them domain assumptions. I wonder how far you can actually surface those. Are they not completely invisible to yourself? Weber talks about surfacing, exactly as you've said, surfacing your prior values, etc. I've always wondered about that, and how can you? They're there, they're part of you, they're invisible to you.
Well, just be a bit more introspective. I guess it starts with asking yourself questions about, so what are those things that I believe in, or that I'm actually that my activities in life are actually based on. Also, I think it starts with that, with being introspective, with being in a way adopting the inquiry approach to your own self. So, and it's not an easy thing to do. No. I absolutely agree with you. It is something that people may
but
find
you can make some progress in it.
Yes, but you can make progress, exactly. And I think it's a good way, or it's a good place, where to start from.
I mean, I guess for me, part of the answer to that comes from the fact that you need to be reading the work of other people that might make very different assumptions.
Yes.
And that makes you very aware, perhaps, that you are looking at other people who've started from a very different place, and your initial knee-jerk reaction will be to say that they're wrong.
Yes. What's this? Yes.
But as you do that more and more, and probably as you try to critique other articles and then realise you can't quite put what you want to say into words, maybe you realise that what you wanted to say was not quite justifiable. And I do think you become a little bit less certain of everyday values. And partly there's an advantage here in the fact that some of these issues are being researched around the world in cultures where the assumptions of the researchers are likely to be very different from ours. I mean, perhaps one of the advantages of our doctoral program is that although the accreditation comes from Lancaster, it's not simply that the cohort is drawn from all over the world, but they are still located in those countries. It's a distance program. So people are being exposed to various literature, and everybody can say, well, that piece of literature is written from a very Eurocentric perspective or whatever, but at the same time their everyday experiences might well be something very different. So you have to draw inspiration from all of these places. I have to say, in the end, I think you will fail to fully externalize all of your experiences and all of your assumptions. I don't think it's possible, but I think you can make progress towards that goal. And it's worth trying. Yes.
It's like travel. Absolutely. I mean, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? It's like traveling the world and suddenly you begin to see your own culture and so on in context. It's kind of intellectual travel, isn't it?
Yeah. I like that metaphor.
Yeah, I've never thought of that before. But yes,
I really
it is.
Like it.
I think I only know what a verb or a noun are because I studied other languages in school. I don't think I learned that from learning English.
No, not at all. You're absolutely right. Me too.
I think that's the analogy I would use.
Yes. What's a gerund? I only found out when I taught English to Italians. Yes. We better move on again. So, Natasha, you were going to say a few things about different theories.
Yes. Well, I have a map here, which is a map on learning theories. So, of course, there are so many theories that we can, draw on and build on in higher education research. And I mean, the pool of theories we can use is, I think, massive. It's huge. So, and I would not think that there is just a handful of theories. So it's very useful to do a little bit of research, starting from your own, position, from your own beliefs, and then also reading, just like what you were saying, Brad, trying to be in that place where you actually read pieces that challenge your own views or challenge the theory that you want to use. I think being critical is crucial to see what the other people say about the theoretical lens you want to use. Anyway, going back to a wide range
show it to the camera, maybe,
of learning theories.
The link is on the video.
Okay, I'm not really sure what is the source of this map.
It's a project called Hotel. It was
Okay.
EU funded, which is holistic technology enhanced learning.
Okay, thank you. Just to acknowledge the source. Okay, so for example, here, first of all, the classification is made from the notion of whether it is it comes from on the notion of the discipline. Okay, so what discipline actually it builds on to start with. So let's say it's psychology or linguistics or philosophy or the approach of education, or let's say there is also a lens of social anthropology and theology. There is also cybernetics, so all sorts of different approaches.
Yes.
Just when it comes to learning theories.
Yes.
So, for example, when it comes to psychology, there are, of course, well-known theories by Piaget, then Vygotsky, his zone of proximal development, then Engelstrom and expansive learning and activity theory that Brett is an expert on, developing his knowledge on. Is that a better word? And then Bruner and the notion of discovery learning, but also linked to scaffolding, and again linked to Vygotsky. So a lot of theories here, that stem from psychology, for example, are connected, because let's say we start with I don't know, one theory which is, let's say, behaviorism, and then we move on from there. So it's very important to look at theories historically. So how, what was in the beginning, or whatever you defined the beginning to be, because it's very questionable. Where do we draw the line and where the beginning is? Then we have Bloom's theories as Skinner. But that Skinner was, in my opinion, I can see here in the map that Skinner is here at the bottom of this list, whereas probably I would put it as something that I would like to believe we have moved.
We've gone beyond.
Yes, we've gone beyond. Radical
Except when it comes to
behaviorism.
dog training.
Exactly. Then, in terms of philosophy, there is the theory, a big field of critical theories, and then critical pedagogy with Paulo Freire and let's say other people in the field. There are very many people in critical theories, ranging from Adorno to Michael Apple, etc.
Yes.
So you can actually
Yes.
talk about these things.
Yes.
I think I would need to talk for half an hour.
Oh yes,
about them.
there are so
you
many
have
out there.
Dewey, then
Yes. Yes. Do you think it's
Illich.
fair to say that theories come in and out of fashion in educational research?
Ooh, that is an interesting question. I would believe that, historically at particular periods of time, particular theories probably, come to the foreground or in a way achieve the limelight.
Yes.
And
I think so,
the
yeah.
attention of the research communities, I think, is placed on those theories. But I guess that is, in a way, that is, I would think, not surprising, because as a society, we develop, we change all the time, and that's why it is in my own words, or in the words of people such as, I don't know, Peirce or some philosophers, it's probably aligned with the spirit of the time, or the spirit of the age.
The zeitgeist, yes.
if you know what I mean.
Yes.
So, yeah.
I mean, I guess there's something there that basically says a theory seems attractive when we first encounter it, if it seems to capture something that we think is important and we haven't been able to capture before. If it gives us a vocabulary to describe our own prejudices even more clearly,
Yes.
we're probably very likely to like it. I mean, I've always been worried that one of the most meme-like examples of theory is learning styles, for example, where what we have is, probably we should say there's an individualistic notion there, that all students are different.
Yes.
But most people who've dealt with students can tell that all students have some differences, that you might present a lecture or anything, and some students learn from that really well, and other students don't learn from it so well. So the obvious temptation, having viewed that kind of situation, is to say, well, everybody's different, and I'm not quite sure about why that might be, then to come across something like learning styles, which suggests that people can be placed into these categories, and it seems very, very catchy. It's, I mean, of course, then, as educational theorists, we can problematize that. We can say, hang on a minute, every type of learning styles inventory that I seem to see has different categories. There's no consistency here. Are people the same each day? Should we tell people that they have a particular learning style? Isn't that giving them permission to not try to acquire the other ones? You can have all sorts of critiques of learning styles, but I think the reason that learning styles or something like that is popular is because it captures an idea that we think we really want to pursue. And the danger with that is that all learning theories don't just capture one idea, but they bring with them a whole load of other baggage. And perhaps, for me at least, learning styles brings with it a whole load of baggage that I'm not happy with. And I don't believe, for example, that all of the other learning theories in the world, the ones on here, for example, are all, apart from learning styles, assuming that all students are the same. You know, I just don't believe that. But it captures it in a really, really direct way, and it's very tempting.
I completely agree.
Thank you for mentioning that, because I often hear things such as, oh, I'm not a visual learner. Which is a part of this, I think, bracketing approach, which I don't subscribe to. Some people, may like it, but I think that actually it's not helpful. And why it's not helpful, it's because, what does it mean to be a visual learner anyway? I mean, if we can see, then everything we do involves some visual component, especially now in the world where let's call it a screen-based culture of the world today, where technological affordances have led us to focus, especially in higher education, on the screen, because especially in our program, we operate within a virtual learning environment. So basically, when you look at that screen, that is a visual experience. So you are almost by default a visual learner, whether you want to agree or disagree with me.
That's a good point, absolutely, yes.
So I guess another point which is quite important, if you look at that diagram, and I'm aware that that diagram is more directly relevant to technology enhanced learning than it is to higher education, but if you look at it, you'll see that all of these fields of research are formed against a wider social tapestry that already is borrowing or can be borrowed from to a wide extent. So I think it's fair to say that higher education research, with perhaps the exception of the US, has been a relatively small research field that is now growing more recently. And so it's probably fairly inevitable that what was going to happen is quite a lot of this borrowing. It's probably fairly inevitable that higher education research was going to borrow from psychology, other areas of education, sociology, all of these kind of areas. And I have to say that I don't intrinsically see a problem with that. But I do think that one problem is to say that we simply borrow and we take this respectful view that says we are learning from what sociology can teach us. And I think the possibility or the potential here is that as higher education grows as a field, and I think we're seeing some evidence of that as a research field, there's more of a possibility for developing novel theoretical contributions within the field. Both concepts that are being developed within the field, but also contributions back to these theories that already exist, back outside that border, so that if we can think of things as having a border, which I actually think is a problem, just for the sake of the analogy, we would then have a two-way communication going on there. I suppose what's been going on until relatively recently is that lots of people come into higher education with a lot of experience in some other fields. So it can often be that somebody whose background is in the natural sciences is interested in some piece of research on the scholarship of teaching and learning, and that is their foothold into the higher education research community. And actually those, if you do that, and I originally did that, I'd be perfectly honest about that, I originally came from a computer science background, and that was exactly how I came in. I'd like to think that somebody like me, obviously, can make a valuable contribution in the end, but I think at some point you have to say, I stopped thinking like a computer scientist in order to make those contributions. So somehow the higher education body of knowledge came back and affected me. So although I came in with some expertise, this is codified expertise, as we were discussing earlier, at some point the higher education research body of knowledge and community has to talk back to that and make a contribution back, develop theory, and I think that's increasingly becoming possible and important.
I think a good example of that is the work of originally Tony Beecher, and then some work I did with him on academic tribes and territories, and then Murray Saunders and Ronnie Bamber, taking basically an anthropological set of theories and applying it to higher education and developing it, bringing other theories into it and giving back in a sense, I think. So that's a nice example. It's a nice way of thinking about that. We better move on, I think. We've got two more things to talk about. One is about common mistakes. No, it isn't. Sorry. What can it do in a doctorate theory? Have we talked about that enough, I wonder? Can we skip that one, maybe?
I mean, I think there's a few salient points. I mean, one of the things is that I think that when you read research, so we've been earlier advocating, and I still stick by this, by the way, but we've been advocating that one way in which you can gain more insights is to read other people's stuff. I still think that's a good idea. But when you read research, the format of papers, the format of theses, the format of all these documents follows certain stereotypes, and it implies that theory has certain places. You know, you might find a theoretical framework section. I think it's important to recognise that all projects are infused with a lot of different theories, not only the ones that made it into that theoretical framework section, that also all projects are infused with theories that make different contributions at different times, and either you forget about it when you're writing up a paper, or you just don't have the word count space to acknowledge it all. So I think it's important to say that theory doesn't just come in at a certain point. You make this decision later on, maybe we did some analysis, you know, that these were the points and the rest of it was not theoretical. I think the point of theory is that you should be acknowledging it from the start. When you think, oh, I have these assumptions about the world I'm going to investigate and how I can come to know something about that. When it comes to having a rough idea, that might not come from a theory you read in a book, but when you decide you're going to use a theory, then I think it might influence the way you pose your research questions. It's always going to abstract away from a broader thing you're interested in. When you're in the process of forming a project, what you do is to gradually take out some things that you decide are not so important. That's problematic because some of the things you decide are not so important, or one theory tells you are not important, might turn out to have been important in retrospect. So, I mean, in some ways there is no ideal way here, but I think it's important to have a wider view throughout a project.
Exactly, and that's why it's important to actually acknowledge the weaknesses of your theory. And I always, I think, advise our doctoral students or the students on my module, and also my PhD students, to consider what exactly they can claim with the theory they are using, and actually what
And
is
what
the
not.
weakness
Yes,
exactly
yes.
of that theory, and I think it is really, really important to think about. Okay, so what does this theory actually is not that good
Yes.
at or with?
Yes. As you said before, every theory illuminates and every theory occludes something. So,
Exactly.
yes, we need to acknowledge the weaknesses too.
Okay.
So, are there any other common mistakes that doctoral candidates tend to make?
I mean, I guess what I would say relates quite closely to what you said before, but it has a slightly different nuance, which is there is a tendency to be very reverent of theory, and that, I think, is actually leading to its formulaic use. So one thing that you will see a lot is with novice researchers is a statement of ontological and epistemological positions. You have these great big thick textbooks that everybody kind of goes and reads, and they say, oh, you must start out in this kind of way, that actually don't really have any impact on the rest of the paper or the rest of the study design. It seemed like a rite of passage to have to say this stuff. And if it didn't have any impact, I question whether you really believed it. So I think that there's a way of using complicated words in a way that you think is necessary or is compulsory to be a member of the research community that you haven't really absorbed, and so they come in at certain points. It's almost like they are that your piece of work ends up like a plate of sandwiches with this kind of stuff just as occasional slices of bread, and then the rest of it. The archetypal nightmarish example is somebody who talks a lot about epistemology and then just has simply done a Likert scale survey of a few things. That bears no resemblance to that whatsoever. So I think that one common error for novice researchers is not so much to over theorize, but to overstate. Or to over-discuss the theory, even at the expense of saying, I'm now going to give an overall introduction to some theory, and then ended up with a front-heavy paper that leaves very exactly because I suppose you're always in danger of having in your mind what you've been reading recently. And if what you've been reading recently is a textbook because you're a novice researcher and you're trying to do a piece of research, you try to summarize all of this stuff. And then you end up not leaving room for your own contribution. So I think that's a big mistake.
In my experience, that's true.
Great.
Yes. Fine. Okay. And just finally, we thought we'd say something about a theory that we've personally used and found perhaps beneficial, although obviously been critical of it. Anybody want to kick off on that?
Well, okay, I can say just a few words about some of the theoretical lenses I have used in my own research. First of all, I want to say that I use the approach of semiotics a lot in my research, and I would like to say that there is a debate surrounding the notion of whether semiotics is a study, approach, or theory. So I won't get into those debates now, but I would just say now it's the study or the approach of semiotics. And basically what is semiotics? Semiotics deals, this approach deals with meaning making and communication. So how we make meaning, how we understand, the symbols and signs in the world. This is the fastest ever explanation of the most condensed ever explanation of semiotics. Of course, there is much more to it. But what I wanted to say is that commonly semiotics, the lenses of semiotics or the approach of semiotics is combined with a theoretical lenses. So, for example, what I have done Okay, let me give you one example. For my master's dissertation, I looked at the notion of national identity formation in relation to pictures, images in school textbooks. Basically, those textbooks were in language and literature. So I combined the approach of semiotics with national identity formation theories, such as constructivist national identity formation theories and essentialist national identity formation theories. Let me just give you an example. For the constructivist ones, Hobsbawm's approach or Anderson's approach, Anderson's imagined communities, for example. Recently, I used Goffman's dramaturgy to look at or actually to conceptualize the ways how students understood the role of social media, in particular Twitter, in higher education learning. So, just
fascinating. Thank you.
Examples. Thank you.
Thanks. And Brett?
Well, the theory I use is activity theory. Since Natasha successfully gave an overview of semiotics very briefly, basically activity is a concept that is aiming to show that this division between the objective world and the subjective world is not a real division, that the two of them are intertwined and constantly developing in relation to each other. And it emphasizes things like the fact that we use artifacts in the outside world to guide our activity, the fact that activity develops historically and can't just spontaneously change, it develops as a result of its own contradictions, and it kind of shows relationships between what is happening in wider social structures, between what people are doing consciously as individuals and what they've internalized so far, as we were talking about earlier with some of the tacit theories, they've internalized so far they're hardly aware of. And it tracks this development over time. Activity changes, the relationships between different things change. And one of the things I find very useful about that theory is the concepts of mediation, I suppose. So it's really about saying, we're often in higher education interested in change. We want to do something new, and in order to do that we introduce something. Now, examples of things I've done might include, in the technology enhanced learning sphere, it involves saying I want to have some impact on some technology enhanced learning process by introducing a new tool. And as a technology person, you're likely to be all optimistic about that and it's going to change the world, and inevitably you discover that's not the case. And so it's been useful to analyze how that tool has been introduced into an activity. It certainly does remediate some of the relationships within the activity, but you find that many of the historical relationships and many of the wider social relationships are remarkably persistent, and we should just know that.
Yes.
But it's not just technology. I mean, there are other examples of where I've studied policy being introduced or actually being developed by some people, say a new curriculum or something like that. And it's, again, remarkably resilient that people are still acting in old ways, notwithstanding that something new is supposed to be coming
changing
in right
the world.
now.
Yes.
So I find that historical nature of understanding human practice is very useful, and the fact that all you can really do is introduce new things that are going to mediate existing activities and perhaps in the end change them a bit. But you can't just change things like that. I find that very useful.
It's absolutely fascinating, isn't it, that area? And my area is linked to that. So I use social practice theory, of which you could say activity theory is an example. There's an interesting article by Reckwitz which kind of pulls all the different strands of social practice theory out. And what I've been doing really is, again, looking at change and trying to understand culture, trying to unpick the jelly-like concept of culture in some of my work, and through a social practice lens, and to look at its various elements. So that we look at social practices, the focus goes off the individual to some extent and onto sets of behaviours and underlying assumptions and so on that is to some extent carried, is the word that's often used, by individuals and can can change over time, but as Brett says, are remarkably resilient, sometimes depressingly so. So yeah.
Let's end on an optimistic.
But I think we can change the world. Great. Well, that's been a really interesting discussion. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
So just to remind you then, this is a video that we've made to introduce and to talk about some of the issues around the HERE doctoral programme, the online learning programme here at Lancaster University. And as I said at the beginning, if you're a member of the programme and you want to email us to follow up any of the issues, please do. I hope you found this video useful. Goodbye.